hate to admit this, but I am a 100% lazy composter. Except for one composting tumbler that I use, for the most part, I just put everything in these composting bins. Now, I always have good intentions. I plan on turning it every once in a while, every week, as they say you should. I plan on watering it and making sure that it gets everything it needs. I want to make sure I have a good ratio of greens to browns like you're supposed to do. But the truth is I just don't. With the garden space that I have to plan on where I'm going to use my time, and a lot of times maintaining a fully active compost pile just really doesn't take priority. Luckily though, there's hope for those of us who are lazy composters. Eventually, everything will compost, right? This year I've probably been the laziest that I've ever been because I did not turn my piles once. I just continued to pile and pile and pile all my garden debris, all the weeds, every spent plant that I didn't want, I just piled on top of each other. So let's see if the lazy composting method actually worked for me and what results that I can expect. And maybe if you're a lazy composter too, what can you expect by just piling it all in and seeing what happens?
These compost bins are completely full with different things that I've added to the pile over the season. As you can tell, I've got some freshly trimmed loofah at the top. I've even got some loofah growing in the compost pile. The bottom of the compost is going to have more of the broken down matter, but as you can see, the top is pretty fresh. The empty bin that you see here is one that I used to put shredded leaves in last season, and I have those already on the garden. So it is empty to be able to transfer the more fresh compost material that you see here into the new pile. Everything that hasn't had a chance to compost down is going into this new bin, partly so that it can continue to break down, but also so that I can access the more composted material toward the bottom of each of the bins. I'm also transferring over not only the green material, but also a lot of the brown material that is still in its original state that hasn't had a chance to break down yet. That will serve as the brown basis of the new compost as I start the new pile. As I dig a little deeper, I notice that this material that seems to be intact is also showing a little bit of composted material that looks more like dirt. So as I get to that part, then I start to realize that I have finally struck gold in the compost in the bottom. Now it looks like I've pretty much gotten down to where I can harvest some usable compost. You can see that there are still areas that are not completely broken down, but for the most part, this is great to be able to use in the garden, particularly in the fall garden where you do have some extras that can continue to compost down through the winter. Now I'm starting to harvest the compost, but I understand that there are still some things left in the compost that have not completely broken down. That was my experiment with t-shirts in the compost pile, and apparently they are probably not 100% cotton because they have not broken down. So that was a lesson that I learned. But what I do when I especially take the top layer is I like to sift it through the pitchfork. That way any large items I'm able to go ahead and keep out of the final product, but I'm really not too picky about it. I just want to make sure and get as fine of a product as I can. Many people have asked me if I have used a composting sifter, and I actually did make a composting sifter one year. I made it out of wood and hardware cloth, which is basically what you see these bins made out of. But I noticed that it was just heavy and unwieldy, and I just didn't really enjoy using it. To me, it's just a lot easier to sift it out this way than to worry about the composting sifter. This is just what's worked out best for me. You may be wondering what kind of inputs that I have included in my compost bin this year. I mainly just use it for garden debris in general when I'm going through my garden, especially at the end of the season, and when I'm pulling weeds as necessary. I try to pull them as much as I can before they go to seed if possible. I also use kitchen scraps, especially during preserving season, the extra tomato, like insides and the skins and that kind of thing. Anything that I use in cooking, there's a lot of kitchen scraps in this as well. One thing that I didn't use in the compost pile this year is I didn't put my chicken manure and shavings in these compost bins this year. I instead put them directly on top of my garden as a mulch. My hope was that with the rainfall and as that broke down into the garden, it would nourish the garden directly. Chicken manure can be a good activator for a compost pile. But because these compost bins open up to the ground and we get a lot of rain in the spring, my fear was that I was losing some of those valuable nutrients through leaching. That's why I decided to not put my chicken manure in the compost bins this year and instead put them directly in the garden. And in the future, I will probably put that in a composting tumbler if I don't need to use them for the garden, such as when I do a fall clean out, for example. With a composting tumbler, I can keep the nutrition in that one space. I don't have to worry about it leaching out. And in that way, I can make my own fertilizer. But for the compost pile for now, I think I'm going to keep the chicken manure out of it so that I can better use the chicken manure in other ways to be able to capture as much of that goodness as possible. So these compost piles are mainly a combination of garden debris and kitchen scraps. Everything is from my property, homemade, over the course of the season. Now that I've got my compost somewhat sifted, I have to decide what to do with it. And because I was harvesting this compost in the fall, I decided to add it directly to a particular row in the garden. You can see that I used spent okra stalks as my line guidance for this particular row. And I just piled it on very thickly. I know that the compost will settle with time, especially over the winter time, but because this row in particular didn't do as well in the garden as I would hoped last year, I want to make sure to get as much compost on this area as I can to help boost that fertility. You can see behind me that I have cover crops growing, and it'll be interesting to see the difference between having a row that's completely cover cropped over the winter and having one that is just plain homemade compost. What you see here is the final result after about 7 or so months of not turning the compost pile at all. Considering that besides just adding the inputs to my compost pile, this was a pretty easy way to get a good amount of compost in a relatively short amount of time. For the rest of the fall and winter, this compost will continue to break down, feed the soil microorganisms and earthworms, and hopefully be able to allow me to grow an even better crop in this area next season.
Here's what I learned from my lazy composting experiment summed up. Yes, you can be a lazy composter too. But if I had been more diligent at turning and watering and layering and making sure the greens and browns were more in line, and also maybe even chopping some of these browns a little bit better, I'm sure that I could have made compost quicker and I would have had more instead of having all of this that has sat most of the season and it's not composted down yet. But still, I was pretty happy with the volume of compost that I got. And one reason I do like putting it on my garden bed in the fall is that it can continue to compost down in place, which will benefit the soil life, the earthworms, everything that has any kind of activity in the fall, the winter, in my climate, and even early spring. Also, putting the compost now will allow some of the weed seeds that I'm sure never did fully compost and get sterilized here because, again, it was a lazy composting method. I'm sure they will emerge, but then they'll die with the cold. So that will be a way for me to limit the amount of weed seeds or even crop seeds left over, like tomato seeds are notoriously famous for germinating after a compost pile. It will allow that to be a little bit less than it would be if I would spread it on in the spring, because a lot of times my compost can have a lot of seeds when I'm not turning it properly and getting it hot enough. That's the thing. This compost is not going to be a hot compost. It's not going to sterilize it. It's not going to kill the seeds. It's not going to kill disease in general because it's just not getting up to temperature. But honestly, for the amount of work that this is, which is very minimal, I'm willing to make that trade-off. Yes, I would love to have fully heated up, perfect compost But that's not a reality for me, and for now, I'll just take what I could get and be grateful that all of this stuff that eventually did turn into compost came from my garden, and I can reuse all of this in order to nourish my garden in the future. So from one lazy composter to another, I hope that this has encouraged you that you don't have to have it all perfect to have good compost.